Hello, I'm Wendy Smith. It's lovely to be here. I am a professor of management, and I have been studying this idea of both and thinking and paradox probably for the last 25 years. I actually went into grad school thinking that I was going to study what we now know as sustainability or social responsibility. It was the late 1990s, and I had been a consultant, and when I was consulting, there was a real focus on how do we increase the profits of the company. But what we were noticing was that in service of profit, with nothing else to pay attention to, companies were engaging in massive ethical problems. It was the time of Enron falling and WorldCom falling, and I was really curious what was going to enable companies to take responsibility broader for something broader than the profits that they were making. And that theme has only increased over the last 25 years. And embedded in that question is this ongoing tension between how do we make money, focus on what the company needs, think about our operational successes, and at the same time think about a broader community, a broader set of stakeholders, something outside of our company, and those are in constant conflict with one another, and it's really hard for leaders to navigate still how do we live in those spaces, and yet that is what we are asking leaders to do today. Why both and thinking? Because we live in a world with lots of big challenges. And in order for us to address those challenges, we need to provide solutions and ways of thinking about them that are different than the ways that we got into these challenges. And so whether we're talking about climate change and racial inequity at the global level, or whether we're talking about companies that need to be navigating globalization, whether that's companies that need to be navigating sustainability or diversity and equity and inclusion, what brings us into those challenges is a kind of binary, linear thinking in which we look at the competing demands that we experience and choose between them and then become incredibly extreme on one side or the other. Climate change is a function of us becoming overly enthusiastic about taking from the earth that we are in without thoughtfulness about the long-term implications. We've been thinking about the short term without thinking about the long term. Issues of globalization emerge in part because we think about the local without thinking about how to navigate the broader global, or issues of innovation. We get stuck in the today without thinking about the tomorrow. Both and thinking offers us an opportunity to think differently, to see the problems in a much more complex way and offer a more complex understanding and therefore set of solutions to address those kinds of issues. I think there's two reasons why now is the time for us to embrace both and thinking and to think about paradox. The first is that we're seeing this kind of thinking actually bubble up all around us, and I like to say we're kind of late to the paradox party. And in the last 150 years, other disciplines have really started to notice that our world is not linear and binary, but much more complex and interdependent. We see this coming out in physics and in our physical world. Quantum physics basically argues that our world is based upon these interdependent opposites. And we see this in psychoanalysis. Our inner lives, our Jungian philosophy, our inner lives are based on the interdependence of the shadow and the reality of life. And it's only now that over the last 20, 30 years that we're starting to see how these interdependent opposites frame our world in organizations, in leadership, in groups, in relationality, and starting to pay attention to that. So I think that this is a broader movement that we are seeing, certainly in the West, of how we think about the physical world, of how we think about our psychoanalytical world, and now how we think about our relational or organizational world. So We are just joining that paradox party. And I think the second reason is in part, we are starting to really pay attention to that because of the complexity that we're experiencing in our world that is surfacing what we think of as these underlying paradoxes. In our research, we have suggested that there's 3 dominant conditions that have us paying more attention to underlying paradoxes and these interdependent opposites. And they are change, scarcity, and plurality. That the change, the faster that we are moving from yesterday into today or today into tomorrow, the more that we experience the tension between the past and the present, and that becomes more poignant or more salient to us. Scarcity, the more that we experience limited resources, the more tension that there is between competing demands for those resources. And plurality, multiple voices, multiple stakeholders, the more that we experience a variety of different voices, perspectives on an issue, the more that we create this tension between these alternative perspectives. What we find in our research is that when people can shift from looking at tensions, competing demands as an either or and trying to choose, and shift into asking how we can accommodate competing demands simultaneously, this opens up all kind of creativity and possibility and new ideas. It's almost a professional hazard when someone comes to me now and says, should we do this or this? I start in my mind and then invite people to just change the question. How can we accommodate both the individual needs of the members of our group and the collective goals that we're trying to achieve collectively? How can we accommodate a workplace that both brings people together in person so that they interact and simultaneously enables people the autonomy to be at home or be more autonomous and independent in their time? So rather than trying to choose, for example, between those opposites, asking that how can we do both question invites in all kinds of possible creativity that answers the questions in new ways, that introduces new ideas. There was a psychiatrist, Albert Rothenberg, and he was really interested in this question of what enabled geniuses to come up with their most creative ideas. And what he finds by looking through the diaries and the letters and the correspondences of geniuses like Einstein or Picasso or Virginia Woolf, the author, what he finds is that underlying their creativity, their best and most creative insights, is a moment where they juxtaposed seemingly impossible, juxtaposed opposites that seemed impossible in relationship to one another, and used that to surface something new. So Einstein's theory of relativity emerges out of the question, how can an object both be at rest and in motion at the same time? That's where we get the theory of relativity. Or Picasso's art is, how can we play with both dark and light within the same experience? And so this juxtaposition of opposites invites us to open up all kinds of new creative spaces that we haven't gone before and solve our problems in new ways. Both and thinking is a way of thinking about our tensions. These tensions show up for us across levels. They show up for us in the strategy of the company, in our leadership. They also show up for us in our operational implementation and execution. So for example, if you're thinking at the operational level, I'm imagining the implementation of a system. Implementing a system means that you have to be planned and thoughtful up front, but then as soon as you start to plan, you see something is going to go wrong, there's new information that you hadn't accounted for. You have to be dynamic and adaptive in the moment. So one of the challenges that you face in implementing systems is thinking about how do you navigate, how do you accommodate the tension of planning while simultaneously adapting and being dynamic. And if you are overplanned and too rigid, then you have the problem that the system actually will fail because it doesn't account for what's happening in the moment. If you are too dynamic and extreme in terms of allowing adaptation, well, then you haven't really created the conditions where you can coordinate across a large group of people. So in the implementation space, for example, you have to deal with this ongoing tension, live in the both and of planning and dynamism. One of the systems that really showed this to us a while ago was Toyota, and thinking about the Toyota production system, because Toyota brilliantly realized that while in producing cars, we had created these systems that were incredibly well thought out in advance, but were not responsive to what would happen in the moment and to learning and adapting and changing in the moment. And so as a result, both things would go wrong and you would have to shut down the whole plant or shut down the whole line and not be able to change, or you failed to, or you lost the opportunity of learning along the way of how to do things better. And the Toyota production system introduced to us, how can we both create the conditions where we are developing structure and planning our systems, but then being able to, as they call it, pull the Kaizen cord, say, push, stop, create small groups where we can say, wait, what happened? What can we learn? How can we introduce this new information along the way? And so that is one example of where both and thinking shows up in the tensions that operating and implementing would create. I'll start with a dilemma, because dilemmas are what show up for us as challenges that beg us for a solution. It's the trade-offs, it's the moments. We call them presenting dilemmas because they are what present to us that ask us to make a decision. And so a presenting dilemma might be that a leadership team needs to decide strategically how they're going to navigate a sustainability agenda, or how they might manage in this hybrid future of work challenge, or what they're going to do about diversity. And they need a decision to be made in front of them. Presenting dilemmas really feel like a trade-off. They feel like if you're going to make a choice, you have to make this trade-off between these choices. Paradoxes are what we say underlie these presenting dilemmas. It's the opposing ideas that both feel like they are contradictory and in conflict with one another, and yet they're also interdependent, reinforcing one another, and they persist over time. They never go away. So underlying a presenting dilemma around innovation might be this underlying paradox of today and tomorrow, stability and change, existing and innovative, or underlying the presenting dilemmas that we feel around a sustainability agenda might be these underlying paradoxes about what we are doing for ourselves as a company and what we are doing outside for the other, or what we are doing for our profits and what we are doing for people and planet. Those underlying dualities in which they are interdependent, those underlying paradoxes never go away. We're constantly dealing with them. So the important issue, or an important thing to note here, is that, at least in the language that we use, dilemmas and paradoxes are not different issues. They're a different lens on the same issue. People will often say to me, well, is this a paradox or is this a dilemma? And what I would say is, well, we experience it as a dilemma in asking us to make a choice, and underneath that dilemma is the paradoxical relationship that informs that choice. And that's important in part because if we're going to navigate these tensions more effectively, the invitation is to look beyond the trade-off dilemma that presents itself to us and start exploring those paradoxes before or in service of a broader and more complex decision. We use the word tension to describe this whole space. Tensions that refer to both dilemmas and paradoxes. It's the overarching term. It's the experience of the tug of war overall. And importantly, we use the word tension importantly, not as something that is detrimental or problematic, but just descriptive, that tensions are kind of double-edged, that we tend to think of them as these problems, these conflicts, these problematic things. But actually, tension is just the experience of the friction between opposing things. It could be problematic, but it could also be opportunistic, depending on how we navigate the tensions. Either or thinking is limited at best and detrimental at worst. It leads to these downward cycles, these problematic, what we call vicious cycles along the way. And we've identified 3 different patterns of how these vicious cycles show up. The first is what we call the rabbit hole, or the experience of making a choice between alternative demands and getting really stuck with the one choice that you have picked so that you can't see the alternative. So consider, for example, one issue that comes up a lot in organizations is, do we as an organization emphasize teamwork, group work, collaboration, or do we highlight and value individual contributions, what individuals have to offer? Well, that shows up as an ongoing tension of how we organize ourselves or how we think about our performance metrics. And you can imagine that an organization could choose, we are a massively collaborative organization. We're going to highlight teamwork. We're going to value how people work together. We're going to create the conditions where everybody has like lots of meetings and lots of integration and and that's great. But if you go to the extreme, excessive teamwork means that people don't have the opportunity to do their individual work along the way. Or we're not valuing what the introvert could bring because teamwork can be exhausting to the introvert. Or in the extreme, that kind of excessive teamwork can become problematic. So the rabbit hole is what happens when we organize around one side of something and we fail to see or value or enable the other. Well, sometimes when that happens, what will happen is something will happen that triggers us to say, oh my gosh, what about the alternative perspective? Imagine that we're in a space where there's so much collaboration that nobody can get anything done, and all of a sudden we say, wait a minute, we need individual time, we need the space for individuality. Then what tends to happen is what we call the wrecking ball, where we've gone so far down one extreme that we overemphasize and move to the other extreme. We call it the wrecking ball because essentially it removes all of the value along with the problems along the way. So it's we like to say throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We move excessively to the other direction. And so we might move excessively to the direction of individuality and giving people space to do their individual thing, and then we lose the value of collaboration along the way. We like to say that with the wrecking ball, you can imagine that space for anybody who's ever dieted, where you might diet and become incredibly disciplined and incredibly focused, and you're really, and you go down this rabbit hole of excessive discipline that all of a sudden, when you stop and give yourself the permission to break your diet, it's like, whoa, everything's off and all hands off, and you've moved completely in the other direction. And then you see yourself swinging between these alternative possibilities. You could think about that in the space of, am I focused on what I need or what others need, and become so focused on what I need that you just have to retrench and move back to what you need. And so you can see this kind of yo-yoing that will happen along the way. The third pattern of why either or thinking is detrimental might be perhaps the most pernicious, and we talk about it as trench warfare. And it's the experience of when we take a position, we do so often in opposition to those that take an alternative position. You can imagine in a group or a team a decision that you have to make where one group takes one point of view, the other group takes the other point of view. And rather than have a conversation between the different points of view about what each thinks, what's the value of each, and how can we think about their interdependencies, what we tend to do is we each become even more entrenched in our own different points of view. So we think about it as trench warfare because you can imagine each side sort of digging deeper into their own trench, surrounding yourself with other people like-minded, reinforcing your point of view, and then almost shooting out at the other side without really engaging with them. And indeed, when it comes to trench warfare, all you have is a whole lot of fatalities along the way. We see this in organizations when there are different points of view, maybe between the R&D team and the finance team, or maybe between those that are doing more of the implementation versus those that are doing more of the broad strategic vision. And those tensions come up, and instead of dealing with that conflict and seeing the possibility of how we can find better opportunities from multiple perspectives, we just, that conflict becomes really detrimental and problematic. You know, we see this kind of experience right now in our national politics, where we see different groups taking different sides, and instead of finding a better way for us to solve our global and national problems through different perspectives, we're just shooting out at each other in a problematic way, in a polarized way. And so each of these limit our possibility for broader, more creative, more opportunist decision making. They also lead us down these detrimental paths that lead to really limited outcomes. One of the things that we have been doing, and when I say we, it's myself and my co-author and colleague for many years, Mary Ann Lewis, is in the research that we have done, we have a whole community of scholars who have asked this question, okay, so if we buy into both and thinking, if we understand that there is this underlying paradox to navigate, how do we do it? And in our work, we have bucketed those approaches into 4 different sets of tools. And importantly, those sets of tools, it's not choosing between them, but these sets of tools reinforce one another in an overarching system. And so we talk about these sets of tools as 4 tools. First, assumptions, how we think about the problem. Boundaries, or how we structure our world and create the context that allows us to reinforce both and thinking. Comfort, or the emotions that we bring to navigate the issues. And dynamics, or the ongoing shifting practices that allow us to be experimental in both and thinking. So let me just give you an example or walk through each of these. One challenge that we have seen in the world recently is this challenge of hybrid work, or as we emerge from the pandemic, how do we navigate the structure of work in terms of whether people need to be in person and together and collaborate, or whether people can be virtual and have more independence and autonomy along the way. And the language of hybridity, at least, suggests that, well, you can do both. But what we find in most organizations is that in an attempt to do both, it's actually the worst of both worlds, that they might implement a 3 days in the office and 2 days at home type of structure, or you get into the office and nobody's there and it's a ghost town and there's no reason to have shown up and people have driven for however many miles in their commute, and then everybody's on their own little computer zooming on their own in their office anyway, and then they're at home and there's no sense of actually being able to find some kind of way of working together. Well, we had the opportunity to connect with an organization called Rocketbook. Rocketbook makes reusable paper to rid the world of paper. They are a subsidiary of BIC, and they've been incredibly thoughtful about how they navigate this hybrid space. And so the first thing that they did was they changed the underlying assumptions or mindsets that either you were at home or you were at work, to really explore and ask the question, how can we get the best out of being both in the office and at work at the same time? And in asking that question, invited themselves to think about, well, what are the ways that we can do this? So they shifted the boundaries, structures, guardrails that they created in order to be able to implement that kind of thinking. And so when we talk about boundaries, one of the things that we find in both and thinking is in order to implement both and thinking, the structure around separating while also connecting, pulling apart the different options so that you really understand each one in service of being able to find the points of integration. And so for Rocketbook, they did the CEO and COO did a deep dive into, well, what is it about being in the office that's really valuable? Well, what's really valuable is that's the moments where you get the points of connection, collaboration, where you have these more spontaneous moments of working together, where you're able to really engage with one another. Well, what is it about being at home? Well, those are the moments where you give people the autonomy and independence to be able to do what they need to do. So they set out the structure of their organization so that when they are together, they reinforce the value of that collaboration. It's the days where they have their all hands on deck meetings. It's the days where they structure at time for people to be together. They have social experiences. They really do a deep dive to make sure that when you're in the office, it's really valuable. And when you're at home, they give their employees as much autonomy as possible to go pick up their kids if they need to, or run an errand that they need to do, making their calendars incredibly transparent, creating the culture where it's okay to take time out of the workday, knowing that that's what's going to get people to actually be present when they need to be present. So by pulling these things apart, they can get the best of both worlds and then create what we call the guardrails that make sure that people don't go too far in either direction, so that they know that they are both creating the possibility for autonomy while enabling the collaboration along the way. One of the boundaries that also is important is we find that organizations and individuals that navigate both and thinking are more effective at doing that when they know why they're doing so and create what we call the higher purpose, or the overarching vision, or the long-term view, the why, because that sense of purpose reminds us why it is that we're struggling navigating between holding these competing demands together at the same time. And so for Rocketbook, they're constantly reminding themselves that their big picture purpose is to rid the world of paper, to create, to enable, and by ridding the world of paper, making it a more environmental world. And they consistently remind themselves of that because that's why they're doing the work that they're doing. The other two components, comfort, is the creating the experiences in which we know that living into both and thinking is uncomfortable. I want to be empathetic in saying that sometimes when we talk about both and thinking, it sounds easy. It's not easy. And one of the reasons it's not easy is because living in this more holistic, interdependent world is complicated and often emotional. It requires us to leave open decisions, to live into uncertainty, which often creates anxieties and fears. It invites us into being open as possible when we have a point of view, to listen and hear and respect an alternative point of view, even if we vehemently disagree with it. Those things are really emotional. That tug of war is an emotional experience. And in order to live into the both and, we have to navigate those emotions. And importantly, we talk about the importance of finding comfort in the discomfort. And what we mean by that is that we don't get rid of the discomfort. We don't reject it. We don't dismiss it. That we honor it, that we value it, that we recognize it, that we say yes to it in order to be able to move forward without it holding us up along the way. What we know is that if we dismiss our difficult emotions, they just come back and have more power over us. And so again, at Rocketbook, one of the things that they have done is create the conditions where people can voice their fears, voice their emotions, have psychological safety, in the language of Amy Edmondson, to enable us to recognize that these difficult emotions exist, and then not allow them to define and hijack, if you will, our decision making. And then finally, dynamics is the space in which we are creating the experimental conditions where we're constantly trying new things amid both and thinking. So both and thinking invites us into constantly recalibrating where we are between our opposing options. In order to recalibrate, we have to constantly ask ourselves, have the practice, are we doing this right? Are we on the right track? Is this the way to go? Can we try something else? Can we experiment? So part of both and thinking requires us to be more dynamic, if you will, experimental, be open to serendipity and new possibilities, and be able to ask ourselves the question, is this the way to go? And one of the things that we saw at Rocketbook is that they were constantly putting their heads together to say, are we in fact on the right path? Is this the way to go? In the language of implement, having the courageous conversations that say, we're not just going to let things go the way that they've always been, but we're going to pause and reflect along the way. And in doing so, course correct, try something new, and be able to sometimes say, look, we're going to make a decision to try something that might focus on being more autonomous, but give ourselves the recognition or the possibility that that's not the final decision, that we'll stop and reevaluate along the way and maybe shift along the way and be more dynamic. So assumptions, boundaries, comfort, dynamics, it's creating the space where all of those work together with one another. We call it the paradox system because it's a system, they reinforce each other. What this allows us to do is navigate paradox, but it's also paradoxical in that this system itself, assumptions and comfort, are about head and heart, cognition and intuition, which are sometimes pitted against each other, noticing that we have to have both. It's about boundaries, which are things that are structured and stable and planned, and dynamics, which are things that are emergent and adaptive and changing. And so it's about the stability and the change. We have to be able to navigate those paradoxical dynamics in service of enabling paradox. Or as we say, my colleague Marianne and I often say, navigating paradox is paradoxical. When people think about both and thinking, one of the things that's possible is that we come to a win-win situation between the opposing sides, a creative integration. This is certainly what I thought when I first went into thinking about both and thinking, that we bring together opposing ideas and end up with this ideal creative integration. And when I was studying IBM, I was looking for where are these moments where they find these perfect integrations between their existing world and their existing product and existing customers, and they bring that to the new world with new customers and their new product. And we call that the mule. And we call it the mule because the mule is this metaphor of the oldest living hybrid. We've been breeding mules for like 3,000 years, which are smarter than a donkey and stronger than a horse, bringing those two together to get to a smarter, stronger animal along the way. And that happens sometimes, and when it does, there is this new creative possibility. But what I found at IBM is that that actually wasn't the way that they were navigating both and most of the time. That rather, most of the time what they were doing is that they were considering, committing to both their existing worlds and their innovation in the big picture, the both and overall. And in service of getting there, they were making these micro choices between between the existing world and the innovation, these micro decisions along the way that sometimes favored one and sometimes favored the other. Sometimes they would put more of their resources or their engineers to redevelop the existing product for their current customers, and sometimes they would have to shift them over to develop the innovation. Or sometimes they would structure their senior team and make some roles and responsibilities that emphasized enabling their existing world, and sometimes they would change their structure along the way to make sure that they were making the innovation and allowing the innovation to succeed. And so what they were doing was making these small shifts along the way. And we call that tightrope walking, because if you can imagine the metaphor of a tightrope walker, it is indeed the person who is on a very thin space trying to move forward, going forward, but they are never fully balanced between the left and the right. They are always balancing along the way. They're making these micro shifts between left and right in order to go forward.
All right.
Yeah.
Good.